Claire Edwards had promised herself she would not cry. She had made this promise standing outside her father's company building on a Tuesday morning in November with her hands in her coat pockets and her face arranged carefully and her chest doing something she refused to acknowledge. She did not cry, but she watched. She watched two men in orange vests take down the sign that had been above the entrance for 22 years. Edwards Infrastructure. The letters her father had chosen himself, had argued about with the sign maker for 2 weeks because the font had to be right, had driven past every morning for 2 decades with the specific quiet pride of a man looking at something he built from nothing. The men lowered it with a mechanical ease that was its own particular cruelty. 22 years. 40 seconds. Claire was 26 years old. She had grown up understanding that her father's company was not just a business. It was the proof that a man from an ordinary background with an extraordinary mind could build something real and lasting and worth being proud of. It was the thing he pointed to when the world tried to tell him he did not belong in the rooms he was sitting in. Now it was coming off the wall in pieces. On her phone, a news notification. She had set up the alert 6 weeks ago when she first understood what was happening. She looked at it now. Wilson Jones of Jones International confirms acquisition of the Aegis project, the flagship contract of the recently collapsed Edwards Infrastructure. Jones calls it a natural expansion of his portfolio. There was a photograph. Wilson Jones at a press conference. 40 years old. Dark suit. The composed expression of a man who had said these words to a room full of cameras before and found the experience unremarkable. Behind him, a slide showing the Aegis project timeline, the same timeline her father had built across 3 years of work, now branded with a different company's name. Claire looked at the photograph for a long time. She thought about her father. Not the man he was now, sitting in a hospital room on the 4th floor of City General with the specific blankness of someone whose mind had begun to leave before his body was ready to follow, but the man he had been. Sharp, certain, laughing at the kitchen table over problems he had already solved before he finished explaining them. That man had spent 3 years building the Aegis project, had passed on other contracts to protect it, had trusted his partner, a man named Gerald Sims, with a financial structure because Gerald had been beside him since the beginning and trust between men who build things together accumulates like capital. And then the project was gone. The company was gone. Gerald Sims had resigned quietly 2 weeks before the collapse with a severance package that made no sense until you looked at it in the right light. Her father's mind had begun its retreat shortly after. The doctors used clinical language. Claire translated it into simpler terms every night in the quiet of her apartment. Her father had been destroyed, and Wilson Jones had walked into the wreckage and taken the most valuable piece of it and put his name on it and stood in front of cameras calling it a natural expansion. She took out her old employee ID card, the one from the 6 months she had worked at her father's company during university. She looked at her own photograph on it, younger, unguarded, not yet knowing what was coming. She took out her lighter. She burned it on the pavement outside the building that no longer had her family's name on it. She watched the plastic curl and blacken. Then she went home and she opened her laptop and she found the application for Jones International. The executive assistant position had been posted that morning. She filled it in under her mother's maiden name, Claire Marsh. She submitted it at 11:47 that evening. She did not sleep well, but she did not expect to. She was not in the business of sleeping well anymore. She was in the business of being very precise and very patient and very certain that when she finally stood in Wilson Jones's world, she would know exactly what to do with the access. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the Aegis project and her father's empty eyes in the hospital room and the sign coming off the wall in 40 seconds. She thought, "I am coming for everything you took." She closed her eyes. She began to plan. Jones International occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower that reflected the sky so completely it was almost invisible against it. The lobby was all pale stone and clean lines, and the specific atmosphere of a building that understood its own importance without needing to announce it. Claire wore a dark suit she had bought specifically for this. Not expensive. Correct. The difference mattered. Expensive announced itself. Correct simply belonged. She had prepared for 3 weeks. She knew Wilson Jones's professional history in the same detail. She knew her own. She knew his acquisition pattern, his preference for undervalued assets in disrupted sectors, his reputation for being demanding with staff and impossibly precise about detail. She knew that he had gone through 4 executive assistants in 18 months, each departure documented in the HR records she had accessed through a contact from her previous job. She knew his coffee order. Black, no sugar, in a specific ceramic mug he kept on his desk that had been a gift from someone whose identity she had not yet determined. She was the 7th candidate of the day. She knew this because the receptionist, a young man named Tobias who had the tired eyes of someone managing a difficult process, had let it slip when she signed in. She sat in the waiting area and listened to the silence after the 6th candidate left the interview room. Then the door opened, and a man came out who she recognized immediately from every photograph she had studied and who was, in person, slightly different from the photographs in the specific way that people with genuine authority are always slightly more present than their images suggest. Wilson Jones looked at the waiting area. His eyes moved across it with the rapid efficiency of someone who processed information quickly and had learned to trust that processing. They landed on Claire and stayed for 1 second longer than they had on the empty chairs. "Ms. Marsh," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. She stood. She did not extend her hand because he had not extended his, and she had read enough about him to understand that he found the automatic handshake performative. He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and went back into the room. She followed. The interview room had a long table and 2 chairs, and a window that looked out across the city. He sat on one side, and she sat on the other, and he looked at the single page of her application in front of him with the expression of a man who has already formed an opinion and is now checking whether the documentation confirms it. He asked her 3 questions. Standard. She answered them correctly, and without excess, because excess in an interview was noise, and Wilson Jones, she had determined, had no patience for noise. Then he looked at her directly. "Why do you want this position?" She had prepared 4 versions of this answer. She looked at him across the table, and she gave him none of them. "I want to understand how decisions get made at this level," she said. "Not the version that gets written in press releases. The actual architecture of it. How someone like you identifies what to acquire and what to leave, and how you justify the line between the two." Something shifted in his expression. Barely visible, but she was watching very carefully. "Someone like me," he said. "Someone who specializes in distressed assets," she said evenly. "Companies that are already struggling when you arrive. You step in at the moment of maximum vulnerability, and you take the most valuable component, and you walk away. I want to understand how you decide what the most valuable component is. Because from the outside it looks like predatory acquisition." She paused. "I imagine from the inside it looks considerably more complicated." The room was very quiet. Wilson Jones leaned back in his chair. He looked at her with the expression she had not seen in any of the photographs. Not the composed professional face. Something more alert than that. The expression of a man who has been sitting through a day of predictable conversations and has just heard something unexpected. "You have considerable nerve," he said, "for someone who needs a paycheck." "I have considerable preparation," she said, "for someone who wants a position worth having." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You start Monday. Human Resources will contact you today." He stood. "Mr. Jones," she said. He paused. "Why?" she asked. "I just questioned your entire business model in an interview." He picked up her application from the table. He looked at it once more. "I want my challengers where I can see them," he said. "Monday, Ms. Marsh." He walked out. Claire sat in the interview chair for 30 seconds after he left. She breathed slowly. She looked out the window at the city below. She had gotten in. Now the real work began. She spent her first 3 weeks being impeccably professional. Not performing professionalism. Actually being it. Because the fastest way to lose access was to give anyone a reason to look at her carefully, and she needed the opposite of that. She needed to become so reliably competent that she became part of the furniture. The specific furniture that people stop registering as present. She was very good at this. She managed his calendar with a precision that his previous assistants had apparently not achieved. She anticipated the documents he needed before he asked for them. She learned the rhythm of his day. The morning hour when he read without wanting to be interrupted, the afternoon window where he was most available for decisions, the late evenings when he stayed, and the building went quiet, and she stayed too, because leaving before him would have been noticed. On the 19th day, she got access to the internal server. She had earned it legitimately. He had needed her to retrieve a document from the project files and had given her the access codes himself without ceremony, the way he did everything, as if the giving of significant trust was simply an administrative step rather than something worth remarking on. She went in that evening after 7, when the floor was empty. She had a list. Specific things she was looking for. Evidence of the mechanism by which Wilson Jones had known about the Aegis project at exactly the moment her father's company became vulnerable. Evidence of coordination with Gerald Sims. Evidence of the kind of deliberate predatory maneuvering that would explain the timing with a precision that went beyond coincidence. She searched for 2 hours. She did not find what she was looking for. What she found instead was a folder she had not been searching for. A financial record. Monthly transfers. Anonymous. Significant amounts. She traced the destination with the careful, methodical attention she brought to everything. City General Hospital. The neurology unit. Her father's unit. She sat back from the screen. She stared at the transfer records. She counted the months. They went back 26 months. Regular. Consistent. More than sufficient to cover the specialist treatment her father had been receiving, the treatment she had not been able to fully account for on the public funding alone and had assumed was covered by a hospital program she had not looked at closely enough. She looked at this for a long time. She told herself it was a tax structure, that men like Wilson Jones used charitable giving as financial instruments, and the destination of the giving was coincidental. She told herself this with the firm conviction of someone who needs a particular explanation to be true. She almost believed it. Then she found the file. Physical. Locked. In the bottom drawer of his desk that she had access to for calendar materials and correspondence. A brown folder with a label in his handwriting. The Edwards acquisition. Her own name. Her father's name. In his handwriting. In a locked drawer. She stood at his desk with her hand on the folder, and she thought about opening it and what she might find inside, and whether what she found would confirm the story she had been telling herself for 6 months or replace it with something she was not prepared for. She put it back. She locked the drawer. She went home, and she sat in her apartment for a long time without turning the lights on. She had come here certain. She had come here with a plan built on a foundation of certainty. And in 19 days that foundation had developed a crack she did not know how to address. She needed more information. She needed to be careful. She went to sleep with the image of the transfer records still visible behind her eyes. The hospital. Her father's floor. Wilson Jones's money, quiet and consistent, arriving every month for over 2 years. Tax structure, she told herself again. She did not sleep well. The storm came in on a Wednesday. By 8 in the evening, the building's management had sent a notice that the lower car park was flooding and recommended staff delay departure. By 9, the rain was hitting the windows with the sustained force of something that had decided to mean it, and most of the floor had gone home earlier, through sensible judgment. Claire was still at her desk. Wilson was still in his office. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the knock on her open door at 9:45. He was holding a bottle of scotch and 2 glasses in a way that suggested he had already made a decision about the evening, and was now informing her of it rather than proposing it. "The storm isn't moving," he said. "The executive lounge has better chairs than this corridor. Bring whatever you're working on." She looked at him. She picked up her laptop. The executive lounge on the 40th floor had a wall of glass that in normal weather showed the city, and in this weather showed the rain moving across the glass in sheets that caught the interior light and turned the window into something almost beautiful in its violence. He poured 2 glasses. He handed her one. He sat in the chair across from her and looked at the rain. She waited for the conversation that would be about work, about tomorrow's schedule or a document she needed to prepare. She had her professional face ready. He said, "My father ran a small construction company in the north of the country. Good man. Built things correctly and charged fairly, and trusted the people around him to do the same." She said nothing. His business partner of 12 years sold their client list to a competitor, Wilson said. He was looking at the rain. Not at her. The company collapsed in 8 months. My father spent the last 4 years of his life believing he had failed because he chose the wrong man to trust. He died thinking the failure was his. He paused. It was not his. But I could never make him believe that. The glass in Claire's hand was very still. That is why you do what you do, she said carefully. The distressed acquisitions. I look for companies that are failing because of external betrayal rather than internal failure, he said. The Aegis project was built correctly. The man who built it was sound. What happened to it was not his fault. She breathed very carefully. What had happened to it? She asked. He looked at her then, directly. His partner sold him out, Wilson said simply. I have documentation. I have been building a case for 14 months that would allow the original architect of the project to be formally credited and potentially compensated if he were ever in a position to pursue it. The rain hit the glass. Claire looked at the city below, obscured by weather, and thought about her father in room 412 and the sign coming off the wall in 40 seconds and the locked file in the bottom drawer. Why would you do that? She asked. Her voice was very quiet. You own the project now. I bought it to prevent total liquidation, he said. The employees had no severance. The intellectual property would have been scattered across 3 different competitors. I acquired it to hold it intact until the situation could be resolved correctly. He reached out. His hand moved toward her face with a slowness that gave her time to move away. She did not move away. His fingers tucked a piece of hair behind her ear with the careful gentleness of someone doing something they had been considering for longer than this evening. Why do I feel, he said quietly, like you are the only person in this building who is not lying to me? She looked at him. She thought, because I am lying to you more completely than anyone else ever has. She said nothing. She looked at the rain. She felt the specific nausea of a woman who has built something on a foundation that is being revealed, piece by piece, to be pointed in the wrong direction. She had the access codes for the Aegis project files. She had acquired them legitimately over 6 weeks of impeccable work. He had given them to her himself without hesitation, the way he had been giving her access to progressively more significant parts of his operation, each step earned through the kind of consistent competence that generates trust without requiring it to be explicitly granted. She sat at her desk on a Thursday morning with the codes and the competitor's contact information and a draft email that contained the first portion of the proprietary data. 1 click. The Aegis project leaked to the market would create chaos in Wilson's stock valuation within hours. His acquisition position depended on the proprietary data remaining internal. Without it, the competitive advantage collapsed. The company's value restructured. The investors moved. She hovered her finger over the send button. She thought about her father, about room 412 and the window she always sat beside, and the way he sometimes looked at her without recognition for several seconds before something settled back into his eyes. About what those seconds felt like. About 22 years of a sign above a building and 40 seconds to take it down. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her father's care facility. She answered. It was the night nurse. Her father had had a difficult evening. He had been asking for someone named David, which was his business partner's name from 30 years ago, a man who had died a decade earlier. He had been distressed and then had gone quiet in the way that sometimes preceded further decline. He was stable, but she should know. She sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended and looked at the draft email and thought about the transfer records she had found on the server. The hospital payments. 26 months. Her father's floor. She thought about Wilson's voice in the storm. I could never make him believe the failure was not his. She pressed send, but not the full file. Half. Enough to create a problem. Not enough to create complete collapse. She did not know why she made this choice until she was already making it and understood that the part of her that had been listening to the rain in the executive lounge had been making decisions she had not authorized. She closed the laptop. She went to get his coffee. Black. No sugar. In the ceramic mug. Her hands were not shaking. She wished they were. Shaking would have felt more honest than the steadiness of someone who had just done something irreversible and was already unsure of its shape. She stole the Edwards file on a Friday afternoon. He was in a board meeting that ran late, and she had the office to herself and the locked drawer and the knowledge that she had been circling this folder for weeks, and that circling it was no longer sufficient. She opened it. She read it standing at his desk. It took her 11 minutes to read every page. When she finished, she stood very still with the last page in her hand, and she looked at the city through the office window, and she processed what she had just read with the systematic precision of a woman who has learned to treat devastating information as data to be organized before it is felt. The file contained everything. Not what she had expected. Not the evidence of Wilson's predatory maneuvering that she had been building a case around for months. The file contained evidence that Gerald Sims, her father's business partner of 15 years, had been negotiating a private sale of the Aegis project data to a competitor for 14 months before the company collapsed. That the competitor had paid Gerald Sims through a series of intermediate accounts designed to look like consulting fees. That when the sale was finalized, Gerald Sims had engineered the company's cash flow crisis deliberately to trigger a distressed acquisition that would obscure the data transfer. The file contained Wilson's 14 months of documentation. It contained correspondence showing that Wilson had acquired the company specifically to stop the competitor from obtaining the complete dataset, which would have resulted in patent violations affecting 17 other companies, including several that provided employment to former Edwards infrastructure staff. It contained a letter, drafted but apparently unsent, addressed to Dr. Vincent Edwards. Her father's name. She read the letter. It was 4 paragraphs, clear and direct in the way Wilson wrote everything. It explained what Gerald Sims had done. It explained what Wilson had done in response. It said that the Aegis project, correctly attributed, represented a significant body of work that deserved proper recognition, and that Wilson intended to ensure that recognition was formally established once the legal case against Sims was complete. It said, "Your company was not defeated. It was betrayed by someone you trusted. Those are not the same thing, and I want you to know the difference." Claire stood at his desk with this letter in her hand. She heard the board meeting end down the corridor. She heard his footsteps. She did not have time to put the file back. Wilson came through the door and stopped. He looked at her, at the open file, at the letter in her hand. He looked at her face. A silence. "I was going to tell you tonight," he said. She looked at him. "Tell me what?" she said carefully. "That I know who you are," he said. "Claire Edwards. Not Claire Marsh. I have known since the 3rd week." The room was completely still. "Then why," she said slowly, "did you not remove me?" He looked at her with the expression she had seen in pieces across the months. The composed surface, and underneath it something considerably less composed. "Because I wanted to know," he said, "what you would do when you found out the truth." The corporate gala was held 3 weeks after the night she read the file. 3 weeks in which she and Wilson had existed in the specific tension of 2 people who know exactly what the other knows and have not yet decided what to do with that knowledge. They worked. They were professionally precise. They spoke about schedules and documents and the 14 points of the formal legal case against Gerald Sims, which was now moving through the appropriate channels. They did not speak about the letter. About what she had sent to his competitor. About the 3 weeks of nights she had spent unable to sleep properly because she had partially destroyed something she had come to understand was not what she had believed it was. She attended the gala as his executive assistant. She wore a dress she had bought with money that was hers. Navy blue. Simple. She had not asked anyone's opinion on it. He introduced her to 3 separate groups of people as his partner. Not his assistant. His partner. Each time with the same composed directness. Each time with a clarity that left no interpretive room. She stood beside him and smiled correctly at the correct people and felt the confusion she had been feeling for 3 weeks moving through her chest with no resolution. He gave her a necklace at the coat check before they went in. He placed it in her hand without ceremony. A simple gold chain with a small pendant. Nothing excessive. The kind of thing that did not announce itself. "You do not have to wear it," he said. "I wanted you to have it." She put it on. At 10:30, he touched her elbow lightly and guided her toward the balcony. The city spread below them, lit and extensive and completely indifferent to the conversation about to happen. He stood beside her and looked out at the lights. "I have known since week 3, he said. I found the connection through your university records. Edwards is not a common surname in your specific academic cohort, and your mother's maiden name is documented in your father's company registration.
Why did you keep me? She asked.
For the second time. Because his first answer had not been sufficient, and she needed the real one. He looked at her. Because your father built something real, he said. And you are exactly like him.
Precise. Certain.
Willing to sacrifice everything for something you believe is right. He paused. I kept you because you were the most honest person in that building even while you were lying to me. Because the work you did was real regardless of your reason for being here. Another pause. Longer. And because somewhere between the storm and the scotch and 14 months of watching you be exactly who you are, I stopped being able to make a professional argument for removing you. She looked at the city. She thought about the partial file she had sent to his competitor. About the damage it had already begun to create in his stock position. About the calls she had received that morning from the rival CEO who wanted the rest of the data and was willing to expose her identity to Wilson if she did not provide it. She thought about how to say what she needed to say. Wilson, she said. I know about the partial leak, he said quietly. I found it 2 weeks ago. She closed her eyes. I did not stop it, he said, because I wanted to see what you would do next. That, she said, is a very dangerous way to care about someone. Yes, he said. I have been told I have unconventional methods. She almost laughed. The laugh surprised her. It came from somewhere she had not expected to find anything except the cold, focused anger she had arrived with 6 months ago. The rival CEO is going to tell you everything, she said. He called me this morning. He wants the rest of the file. I am not going to give it to him. I know, Wilson said. How do you know? Because you are your father's daughter, he said simply. And your father would not have done it. She looked at him. She felt the necklace against her throat. She felt 6 months of carefully constructed certainty dismantling itself with the systematic efficiency of something that had always been built on the wrong foundation. I came here to destroy you, she said. I know, he said. I was wrong about what you did. Yes. I am not sorry for coming, she said. I needed to understand what happened to my father. I know that too, he said. The city lights moved below them. Somewhere in the building behind them, the rival CEO was watching them through the balcony glass with the expression of a man whose leverage was evaporating. What do we do now? She asked. Wilson looked at her for a long moment. Now, he said, we go back inside, and we make sure Gerald Sims does not walk away from what he did. And after that, he paused, we figure out the rest. She looked at him. She nodded. They went back inside. The case against Gerald Sims was filed formally 6 weeks after the gala. Wilson's legal team, combined with the documentation Claire had independently assembled during her months inside the company, produced a case that the prosecution described as unusually thorough. Gerald Sims's legal representation advised him to accept the structured settlement, which he did in the 3rd week of proceedings. The Aegis project was formally reattributed to its original architect. Her father's name went back above the work. Claire sat in Petra Rawls' office on the day the settlement was confirmed, and she read the formal reattribution document, and she felt something move through her that she had not felt in over a year. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter. The specific settling of a weight that has been carried for so long you have forgotten the shape of yourself without it. She went to the hospital that afternoon. Room 412. The window. The chair she always sat in. Her father was having a clear day. These came and went with no pattern she had been able to identify, and she had learned to receive them as gifts rather than expect them as due. He looked at her when she came in. He said her name. Her real name. Claire. Not the nurse's name or David's name or the name of someone from 30 years ago. Claire, he said. Hi, Dad, she said. She sat in the chair. She took his hand. She told him. Not everything. The version that was true and sufficient, and that he could hold without it being too heavy. She told him that Gerald had done what she had suspected, that it was documented, that his name was correctly attached to the project he had built, that the work he had done was formally recognized as his. He looked at her for a long moment. I always knew it wasn't my fault, he said. But knowing and believing are different things. I know, Dad, she said. Your mother used to say that, he said. He looked at the window. She was right about most things. She held his hand and looked at the light coming through the window and breathed. She stayed for 2 hours. When she left, she stood in the hospital corridor and checked her phone. A message from Wilson. Not about work. Not about the case.
How is he?
She stood in the corridor and looked at this message from the man she had spent 6 months preparing to destroy and who had known who she was from the 3rd week and had kept her anyway and had been paying for her father's specialist treatment for 26 months without telling her, and who had looked at her on a balcony with the specific expression of a man who had stopped being able to make a professional argument for keeping his distance. She typed back, "Clear day. He knew my name." 3 seconds. "Good," he wrote. "Tell him the work was excellent. From someone who knows." She put her phone in her pocket. She walked down the corridor. She thought about the sign coming off the wall in 40 seconds, about the lighter and the old ID card on the pavement, about the application she had filled in under a different name with the focused intention of someone who believed they knew exactly what they were walking toward. She had been wrong about the destination. She had not been wrong about needing to make the journey. She pushed through the hospital doors into the afternoon air.
Cool and still.
The city going about its business with the indifference it reserved for private reckonings. She thought about what Wilson had said on the balcony. "We figure out the rest." She did not know what the rest looked like. She was not yet in a position to know. There was damage she had done that required acknowledgement. There were conversations she and Wilson had not yet had that they needed to have. There was the work of understanding who she was now that the thing she had come to do was done, and the person she had been doing it to was not the person she had believed him to be. But she was standing in afternoon light outside her father's hospital with her father's name correctly attached to his work and a message on her phone from a man who had chosen to see her clearly even when clarity was not in his interest. That was somewhere to begin. She walked to her car. She drove without a destination for 20 minutes through the city she had been moving through for months as someone else. Then she found herself, without entirely intending it, parked outside the Jones International Building. She looked up at the glass tower, reflecting the sky. She thought about the impeccable professional who had sat in an interview chair and called his business model predatory acquisition and watched something shift in his expression. She smiled. Small and genuine. The kind that arrives without announcement. She got out of the car. She went inside. She took the elevator to the 40th floor.
He was at his desk.
He looked up when she came in. He waited. "The rest," she said. "I'd like to start figuring it out." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had learned to read across 8 months of carefully maintained distance. "Sit down, Claire," he said. He used her real name. Her actual name. The one she had not heard from him until the night on the balcony. She sat down. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do. Moving forward. Indifferent and enormous and full of people rebuilding things that had been broken, adding carefully to foundations that had survived, beginning again from wherever beginning again was possible. She looked at Wilson Jones across the desk. She thought, "I spent 6 months learning how to burn this down." She thought, "I think I would like to spend some time learning something else." She picked up his coffee cup and handed it to him because it had gone cold while he was working, and she had been noticing these things about him for 8 months, and she was finished pretending she had not been. He took it. He looked at her over the rim. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. Some beginnings do not require words. They only require 2 people deciding at the same time to stop moving away from something and start moving toward it instead. Outside the window, the city carried on. Inside the office, something that had been broken began, quietly and without announcement, to find its new shape. Some plans take us to exactly the right place through entirely the wrong door. Some enemies turn out to be the people who were quietly doing the right thing while we were preparing to punish them for the wrong one. And some loves arrive not in spite of the complicated journey to them, but because of it. If you have ever discovered you were wrong about someone who deserved better from you, and had the courage to say so, this story is for you. If this story reached you, please like, share, and leave a comment below. Tell us which moment stayed with you. Take care of yourselves. We will see you in the next story.